helpful.
Oh, good. I love Facebook. That's about the only one I'm on constantly. I like Instagram, but I don't really, you can't really interact as much as you can on Facebook.
And you guys are live.
Well, hello and welcome to Coastal Magic on Continual. We are doubling up here for some real fun. And right now we're talking about history two ways, the way it happened and maybe the way it should have happened. But before we get into that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. With Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station science fiction mystery series, and I independently publish several subgenres of romance.
Okay, and Hildy.
Hi, I'm Hildy McQueen, and I write medieval Highlander romance. And I also write a bit of other historicals. I have some American historicals that take place in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. But for the most part, I stick to the Highlands and times of hunky men like the one behind me.
Yes. And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic and urban fantasy. And as Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. Co-written with my husband, Larry N. Martin, we have the Iron and Blood series, which is set in 1898 in an alternative history Pittsburgh, and the adjacent Storm and Fury stories, which is also set in that time period. And then we also write the Joe Mack Adventures, which is set in 1929, Roaring Twenties Monster Hunter. So we've played a little bit, dabbled with changing history. What attracted you to the time periods that you write about? Hildy?
The main thing that attracted me to begin with to the medieval Highlands was just the idea of, seeing the castles and how life was going to take place there. And I became more and more curious about it. At the time that I actually went to castles and started studying medieval Scotland, I was writing a totally different genre, but that genre just pulled to me. And I ended up just deciding that was something that I wanted to know more about, and it attracted to me, and I started reading more about it. So that's why I started writing it.
That makes sense to me. Nancy?
Well, what pulled me into this particular series is my long-running interest in the controversy surrounding Richard III. I've been a history geek since I was little, and in graduate school, a friend gave me a copy of Josephine Tay's The Daughter of Time, which, for those of you who are not familiar with it, features her character, Inspector Alan Grant, and through a series of investigations, he concludes that Richard III did not kill his nephews. And so that led me to the Richard III Society, who are all gung-ho to reassess the king's reputation. And I began to think about it instead of just what I had learned in history classes that taught the traditional view. And so the Herald of Day is set in 1674, which is the year the bones that are supposedly those of Richard's nephews, Edward IV's sons, the princes in the Tower, were found at the Tower of London. And so I wanted to come up with an explanation of how this all could have happened. And at the time, the leading candidate to have done this, to have killed the boys other than Richard III, was the Duke of Buckingham. And so the series is premised on a wizard, because there's got to be magic, who inadvertently helped Buckingham's agents sneak into the Tower of London and murder the boys. And then King Richard was blamed, and the wizard couldn't speak up because Richard was killed at Bosworth Field. And to speak up under the Tudors, who blamed him for everything, would have been fatal. So he cursed his entire family line, and none of the heirs can rest in life or death until they clear the king's name. And that gave me license to play in other periods. The second book, The Steel Rose, is set in the Regency, and the climax is the Battle of Waterloo. And you want to talk about rabbit holes, the Battle of Waterloo certainly is one. And then I've always been fascinated with the Battle of Britain and the early days of World War II. And so that's when the King's Champion is set. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. It's just three different time periods, kind of three different things drew me to them.
Yeah, with us, the urge to set the Jake Desmond books and the Storm and Fury books in Pittsburgh is we lived there for 10 years. And Pittsburgh has a huge amount of 1800s infrastructure left. Of course, that was its heyday. It was referred to at one point as hell with the lid off because of all the smoke and the flames from the steel mills. It was a cradle of the robber barons with Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick and all of those guys. And it's just a city where there's a lot of fascinating history tucked in every corner. And so by setting Iron and Blood there and the upcoming sequel, Spark of Destiny, and the Storm and Fury books, which deal with two agents from the Department of Supernatural Investigation, we got to dig around in a lot of the little corners and crevices around Pittsburgh, and of course add absinthe magic and creatures in the mines underneath the city, and all kinds of supernatural elements as well as airships and velocipeders and lots of technology that didn't happen but should have, which is how I explain steampunk as the Victorians as they never were but should have been. And so we played a little fast and loose with a bit of the city's history, but for the most part, it's Pittsburgh. And I still love the city, and writing books set there provides a terrific reason to go back, like I needed one, and go poke around for book research purposes. And the Joe Mack books set in 1929 also have a Pittsburgh connection because Joe originally died in the Homestead strikes. And he swore vengeance and called on a Slavic god to avenge him. And Crocus, the god of blacksmiths, shows up and makes him his champion. And now Joe is immortal with a number of magical properties, and he is sent out to be the champion of those who aren't getting a fair shake. And so fast forward to 1929, he is dealing with Lovecraftian monsters in the mines below Reading, and the occult fallout of Al Capone's arrest in Chicago, and Leninist werewolves and imperialist vampires in Cleveland. So Joe has a pretty full dance card, but it's just fun to get to play with all the many things that were going on in that time period, as well as the cool fashions. So Nancy, you opened a door here talking about a rabbit hole, and you can't do alternative history or mess with time travel without doing a lot of research. So what's your research process, and how do you know when you've done enough and it's time to stop researching and start writing the darn book?
Well, my son would tell you I don't know when I've done enough. I generally go by a gut feeling because a lot of, as you all I'm sure do as well, I read and learn a lot more than actually turns up on the page. But the Herald of Day is the only one that's truly alternative history. And so I didn't have to do as much research for that. I read a biography of Charles II. I was a history major, so I've got texts on the history of England, read about the period there. And then if you're going to do alternate history, I think you need to find a pivotal point. And for me, the pivotal point was the death of Oliver Cromwell, because his son was so comparatively incompetent, as often happens with famous historical figures and their heirs. And so that was the turning point for the change in history. With the others, I didn't have to find a turning point like that. So I read a general history of the period. I generally read a biography. I read parts of a biography of Napoleon for The Steel Rose, primarily focused on Napoleon during the 100 days between his escape from Elba and the Battle of Waterloo, because that's the period the book takes place. And for The King's Champion, I already knew a lot about it. I read a lot of books about the Dunkirk evacuation because that's when the book opens. And I discovered something I had known about other things, but it's different with Dunkirk because people who were there are still alive. Not very many of them anymore, but there are still some. And every book I read had some detail in it that the other books didn't have. And so I soon came to realize that this could be not only a rabbit hole, but a black hole, sucking me into it and keeping me from ever putting words on the page. My son would say, as I mentioned earlier, that I don't know when to quit, because in the Herald of Day, there's a running battle from the Palace of Whitehall down to Westminster Abbey. And at one time, there was a wall around the Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey. So they formed kind of an enclave in the city of London. I don't know how long that wall was there. And so I was trying to figure that out. Are these people going to have to magically blast a hole in this wall, or can they just run on down to the Abbey? And finally, my son said, Mom, how many people do you think, like in the world, know the answer to that question off the tops of their heads? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe 6. And he nodded and he said, so how many of them do you think are going to read your book? And I looked at him and said, it only takes 1. And he just rolled his eyes and walked out of the room. So, but generally the answer is when it feels like enough. And then I'm always having to go back and check some little detail.
Hildy, how about you?
What was the question?
How do you do your research? How do you know when you have enough? How do you keep from getting sucked down the rabbit hole and never writing the book?
Oh, okay, good. Yes. Rabbit holes are my happy place. And so I do have to be careful with that. Most of my research is because is books. I buy books like this one. It's a History of Scotland by Neil Oliver. And I have these 2 with me. This one's called Scottish Miscellany by Jonathan Green. I like to know the nuances and the practices when it comes to home life, what they wore, how they said things, what they ate, the basic things like that is where I focus more on, because I'm not well studied. I don't have a historical degree or anything, although I did study a little bit of history, but my college degree has nothing to do with history. So I kind of rely on others, to find the details, other authors that are well studied and have written books about it. My stories are more centered on the dynamics of the characters between each other, and very seldom do I leave the small environment of their keep and the areas around there where the battles are taking place and the interactions between the characters and the clans. In this series behind me, the Clan Ross of the Hebrides, it takes place in 1620s on the Isle of Uist, which, if you're true to history, my clan battles and all that's going on never happened. So it's very alternate history, because the island was practically uninhabited, but for a few people back in the 1600s that probably never even saw a sword. I mean, I think they spent their entire time, fishing or farming or just living their lives on the Smile Islands off the coast of Scotland. But in my books, there is a lot of stuff going on because I write, the clans are clashing and people are coming in trying to invade their territories and things like that. And then they have their allies in the other islands and their foes and stuff like that, because that's totally alternate history. I do, of course, at the beginning of each of these books, that is explain which clans were actually where, what was going on, because there were some pretty large, powerful clan territories on the Hebrides, like Clan MacDonald was there, Clan MacLeod had a presence, and Clan MacNeil. The bigger ones were there. So, but there was not as much clashing or battles or any of that going on back then. So if I do need to, I will go and see who the ruler was at the time, but and maybe Nancy can correct me, but the 1600s is kind of an easy time to write about Scotland because there isn't a lot written for that period. There seems to be a lot of vague about what was actually going on in the Highlands during that time. Besides clan clashes, the English and the Scottish were battling against each other, and that stuff was going on, but it was mostly down in the southern portion of Scotland and the lowlands, and so I take advantage of that to a nth degree. Yes, I don't want to. It is, write historical medieval romance for the romance, and if I wanted to learn more about what's going on in history, I think I would read Nancy's books.
Well, I can't help you with Scotland. You know way more about that than I do.
Yeah, so I mean, there are authors that are so good at interweaving history into their books, and I am just mesmerized reading them. And I wish I could write that way, but I tend to stick more to the customs of the time, what's going on around their surrounding immediate areas, their speak, their clothing, their traditions, you know, Highland games, things like that. And so I guess because I'm a shallow person that likes fun things, I stick to the fun things that these people did, you know, sex.
Oh, there's nothing shallow about
food.
that at all.
Sex, games, and food, yay!
That's so fascinating, though. But knowing those intimate details is what brings history alive, in some ways
Right.
different from the battles, because hopefully most of us won't experience a battle, but we have dinner every day and we wear clothing and we want to know what the house looks like. And so I think the two of them together, for me as a reader, really make the past come alive, because if I know what they're eating and they're wearing and you know what they do on an everyday basis, but then I can get sucked into the drama of the big picture and the battle. I mean, you know, bring me the popcorn. I'm in.
Yeah.
Could I speak to something that Hildy said before we move on?
Sure.
Which is that I totally get the fascination with the clothes and the food, because when I was in college studying history, we mostly studied who fought whom, where, when, why, and how. It was mostly political and economic history. And my senior year, we had a professor who offered a class called American Thought and Civilization to 1865. And that's what alerted me that there was this whole field of history out there about what people wore and what they ate and how they lived. And I think a lot of times when we think history, we don't think about those things enough.
Exactly. Yes.
I think the other thing we forget, because history is so often taught as this dry, boring list of, you know, dates and things to remember, is it's the biggest reality show ever. And people did stupid things that changed the course of nations. And there's so much intrigue and drama and scandal. I mean, you know, it gets steamy out there because people have been doing steamy stuff forever, so they didn't just invent it. And they never teach you that stuff in like high school history. You get parts of it I was a history major in college because I knew I wanted to write epic fantasy. You get some of that depending on your professor and if they have a personality and they like teaching you that stuff. But I just loved finding out how human the people were in the past, because, you know, we kind of file the VIN numbers off them as we move them into statues and busts in libraries where they seem very remote and different. And no, they were just messed up people like the people now. We just have whitewashed that and you know, collectively decided we're going to ignore that. It's so much more interesting when you find that out. And with Pittsburgh, I loved exploring a whole new level to the city that we lived in and the area that we came from, and finding all these mysteries and scandals and opportunities to come at things from a little different way and play with some of the not just the food and the clothing, but also the Victorians had so many crazy rituals for everything. They were obsessed with what the flowers in a bouquet meant, and they sent elaborate messages with them, and their fans and their clothing. And, you know, wow, is that a rabbit hole? But it's fascinating because this is what people did before social media. They worried about all this stuff. And so, yeah, when I get stuck with a plot point, I go out and research something, because sooner or later I will find the missing piece I didn't know was missing, and I'll go, that's what I need. And that'll unlock everything that's been blocked. So which time period, is there a time period that you wish you could visit or live in? And what would that be and why? Nancy?
Two time periods that I would like to visit very briefly, because they didn't have antibiotics or hot and cold running water. The whole thing about the princes in the tower is just fascinating. And over the years, I've become convinced that those boys survived their uncle. that, as royal households so often did, one day they packed up and moved, and King Richard sent them somewhere Henry Tudor couldn't find them easily, and then they couldn't find it when Henry won. So I would like to visit the Tower of London in the fall of 1483 and find out what happened. Just long enough to find out what happened, because I really do like having toilets on the premises. Guard robes, not quite the same thing. And the other period I would like to visit, again, briefly, because all that other stuff plus mosquitoes, is Roanoke Island during the period of the Spanish Armada, because I'm a North Carolina native, and the Lost Colony, I've heard about it all my life. I'd like to know where those people went. So I'd like to be a fly on the wall when they decided where they were going to go. Would probably have a little trouble understanding Elizabethan English because it was pronounced very differently. But, as long as we're doing time travel, we can do time travel and translation as well. So I would pick those two.
Okay. Yeah, Doctor Who manages the time travel and translation, so why shouldn't we?
Exactly.
Hildy, how about you?
That's an interesting point. I can imagine, I was going to say until this came up that probably the time that I write in the 1620s, Highlands of Scotland, but it was probably a dirty, dirty time, and I probably couldn't understand what they spoke, because they spoke Gaelic, and I would be totally, I have to pretend I was mute or something. So, and kind of go through sign language stuff. But I think that would be so interesting to see how exactly life happened in those keeps and castles, and how people were so resilient back then, weren't they? So I that would be so much fun. But yeah, maybe for a 24-hour period and then scoot on out, that would be cool. I would like to probably return back to the same area that I was in during the 1600s, back probably then in the 1800s. Or end of the 1800s, where things were a little bit more modernized, and there would be more to see and understand, and see the changes that would have happened in those 200 years. It would have been fascinating to go back and see that. I'd like that.
Yeah, I agree that I would like to go back and see something for maybe a day or half a day, but I do like modern plumbing and hygiene and antibiotics. And so there's a real appeal to not going back in time and dying.
You don't want to get lice and
lice, scurvy, cholera. I mean, you name it. They're also not quite sure that with the lack of refrigeration, I could survive eating too many meals. I think you had to be hearty stock to come through all of that. One of the things when I was growing up that I could always talk my parents into on a vacation was going to a location that did historical reenactment. So Colonial Williamsburg or Sturbridge Village or Mystic Seaport. I could get them to do that because it was educational. Don't you want to go to the educational place? Please educate me. And I just loved them. And you had people who would dress up and use the language of the time and learn how to do the blacksmithing or the baking the way they did it back then, as best we can tell. And then you could talk to them about it, which was about as close as you can get to talking to someone from the past, because they really knew their stuff. And I was just always fascinated by that very faithful recreation. And it was about as close as we can get to going back in time. And so that has stuck with me as loving those details, but also, I look at just what it took to get dressed in clothing back then without zippers and some of the modern fasteners. And I'm thinking, wow, it's amazing anybody got anything done without all the modern conveniences we're used to. So the late 1800s are close enough to our time period to have some of the conveniences, but far enough away to be different, especially in the Victorian era. So I think that would be the one I'd pick to poke around in. Now, are there any historical periods that fascinate you that you haven't yet written about? And what would they be, and what's got you hooked on them? Hildy?
That's a good question. I actually have considered, because I'm from California, doing more research and writing the 1870s period or so in California. I guess it was right around the gold rush. It was right before the gold, when all these big cities were beginning, San Francisco and all those cities were being settled, and all the people were going there because they, a lot of the Civil War, people that got away from the South and people that left the military and had nothing else to do and went west, to seek fortunes and start all over. A lot of them kept going. Some stopped in, Montana, Wyoming, wherever, and did the gold thing. But then as things started drying up there, they kept going west. And so I kind of am super interested in doing more research and writing stories about California around, the late 1860s, beginning of the 1870s. I think that would probably be a neat time frame. I don't know what it would be. Would it be an American historical early, or I don't know what it would be called, American historical, I guess. I think that would be cool to write that time period, maybe from the view of a brothel.
Nancy, how about you?
Well, there are two. The Wars of the Roses, the whole Richard III thing sucked me into the Wars of the Roses. And I actually have an unpublished historical romance, which is not fantasy. The Boar King books are historical fantasy with very strong romantic elements, but this was a straight historical romance. But I've never published it, and it would need some work to come out. And I'd like to play around in that period more. And I've always been interested in colonial America. I really related to your story about wheedling your parents into taking you to reenactment museums, because I was so proud of myself when I harassed my parents into taking me to Kings Mountain, where there was an important Revolutionary War battle. Manly Wade Wellman wrote a series of young adult historical novels, 4 of them, about the American Revolution in the Carolinas. And at the time, I didn't know that he was a science fiction writer. I just knew I loved these books. And I think that's where my love of that period probably comes from. I checked them out of the library over and over and over again because I loved them so much. And I've just never played in that period, and I'm not really sure why.
Yeah. The period that I haven't played in yet, but I do have a book series that's going to be set there, is the 1890s in the West. And I was so astounded when I took a class on the American West in college, and I found out that the cowboy era lasted 15 years in the real world. As decided by, that's when they fenced the ranges, and you no longer had the big cattle drives and the open range and the cowboys, yippee-yi-yay, and all that. But when they fenced the range, changed how they did ranching, and that period really didn't exist. Of course, it's existed for over 100 years in TV and movies and books because we just can't let go of the cowboys. And I loved when you studied it and studied the history, that there was a lot more diversity with the cowboys than we tended to see in Hollywood, that they came from a lot more backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and heritage. And the West was a lot more interesting place than we give it credit for, thanks to Hollywood. And so I am looking forward to doing the Sharps and Springfield series, which is adjacent to the Storm and Fury series. It's going to be sort of like Wild Wild West if Jim and Artie were together. And then everybody goes, you mean they weren't? And, they were watching Robert Conrad's tight pants, weren't we all? But I'm going to enjoy doing that with an eye toward more of that realism in terms of who was actually there and what was going on, as well as the overlay of magic and supernatural stuff. So
that sounds interesting. That sounds awesome. Go write it.
I will. That's coming up this spring. But that's definitely something that fascinates me. Even though overall I'm not a huge fan of Western movies, but part of that was the storylines that tend to go with a lot of the traditional Westerns weren't my cup of tea, and I knew that they weren't very accurate. Now, let's talk about museums. Are museums catnip to you? Can you go to a museum and come back out the same day? Hildy, and what are some of your favorite museums, or what have you found most fascinating in museums? Hildy, how about you?
When I first moved to Georgia, because my daughters and I had been living on Oahu in Hawaii for most of their life, the first 10 years of their life. We were so excited to move to the mainland that we drove up around, we would drive 5-6 hours, not caring. And on the weekends from school, from Georgia, we would drive to the Smithsonian. It's only 9 hours? Yeah, sure. So we would traipse through every single museum. And I always found it fascinating that my daughters would just sit and stare at the art in the art museum and the historical ones, the really, and it was funny because at that time I wasn't writing yet, but we always got stuck in front of the historical art. And that really drew all of our attentions, just the beautiful gowns, the depictions of earlier times. And so it wasn't per se a historical style museum, but it was the art that drew us. And it just got our imaginations going. On the drive back, we would just talk about the different pieces. There are these huge pictures that I can still see in my mind by Cole. And it was a man's, what do they call the journey of life, where it starts with a little child on a boat and it goes into the young man, and then at the end it's the old man. Anyway, that used to be our favorites. So that kind of got, our history has always been catnip to me, but we would spend so many hours there. When I went to Scotland and walked through the Duinen and other castles, it was the same thing. But like I said, I am attracted to the basic things about it, because when you walk in, you hear, of course, the first episode is the first, not episode, I'm thinking of movies. The first thing you see is like this guy over a wall, and he's holding a bow and pulling it taut, and he's looking down on his enemies, and it talks about somehow they defended the keep or whatever. But I would spend an hour sitting in the kitchen just looking at the bowls and the things they used to make meals with, and that kind of thing was what attracted me. And yeah, I could spend hours, I could spend an entire day at any castle, but you'll find me stuck in like a bedroom looking at the, how the bed was situated, where looking under the bed, oh yeah, there's their little, basin and this and that and the other. That kind of stuff is what, draws me. But yeah, oh man, if you're just talking about it, makes me want to go to one right now. I want to go.
Nancy?
I love museums. The first trip that my husband and I ever took together, we went to Savannah a few weeks before we were actually married. And on the way down, I said to him, I'm going to warn you right now that I read every single word of every single historical marker. My dad did that, and it drove my mom nuts. So I figured I was just going to warn him up front that this was the way it was going to be. I love historic houses because, like Hildy was saying, that ties into how people live. And I love to see what does the flooring look like? Not only the beds and the kitchens and the tables, but how are the rooms arranged? Are there hallways with rooms branching off of them? Are there, like at Hampton Court Palace, you go from one room to another room to another room to another room, and apparently how many rooms you got to go through without being stopped had something to do with your status. So I love those. I can get in and out of a museum in a day if it's not a big museum. The Smithsonian, the British Museum, no. Those are a day per section. But one of the museums that I really love, and I think it tends to get overlooked a lot because it's small and it's not as famous, is the Museum of London. And that has more about how people lived in it. One of the things I love, and I've tried to take pictures of it, and the glass reflects, even though you can't use a flash in the museum, I can't get it without the glass reflecting things. They have a display of Manton's dueling pistols, which were the dueling pistols of the Regency. And so I've tried to take pictures of that. And the Victoria and Albert has a costume section. They also have a lot about how people lived and household goods and furnishings. And I walked through there taking photo after photo after photo because I knew I would not remember it when I got home. just because of the whole history geek thing, I went to the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard and the National Museum of the Royal Navy and took a trip over to the island. They kept their powder magazine on a separate island, which was probably a smart idea, but there's a museum there. So I walked through, again, taking photo after photo after photo of things from the age of sail, because I knew I would remember it when I got home. And I know other people thought I was crazy because I looked like I was experiencing the museum through the lens of my camera, which was not accurate. But I don't trust myself to remember what I saw where unless I document it. So yeah, museums are great.
I talked my parents, again, dragged my parents to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh when I was a kid because they had dinosaurs. They had all the big dinosaur bones. And yes, in the intervening years, we've discovered that they did have the wrong skulls on some of the wrong bodies and may have added some extra bones to some of them that might not have belonged to that dinosaur. But it was so amazing to see these reconstructed skeletons and stand there and see how big they were. And that just amazed me. And then it's a great museum. It has a gemology section where you can see all these pretty rocks. It's got an art museum section. It's got all different kinds of stuff. So even when we lived there, that was a place that I loved to find an excuse to have to go and explore. There's one whole section that has all the diorama rooms from a extremely elaborate dollhouse made for, I think, one of the daughters from the Mellon Bank family, and no expense was spared. So it's just a very memorable place, and I did set a battle in Iron and Blood on the main staircase. So that's one of my all-time favorites. The Richmond Museum of Art in Richmond, Virginia is another favorite. We lived there very briefly, and I had small kids. And I would take them to the museum, but to get them interested in art, we would rename each room in the museum after a relevant Disney movie. So the Hindu art from India was the Jungle Book movie, and the African art was the Lion King movie. And so that got them really into looking at the stuff, because then it was something they could relate to. And they had all of the Fabergé eggs that had belonged to some of the Russian royal family. And it was right at the time the animated movie Anastasia came out. And my girls were so into that movie. And to take them and show them that egg actually belonged to Anastasia. That's the real thing. They still remember it, and they were so little at the time. And then the other was getting to go to the Field Museum in Chicago when I was there for a convention. I was there by myself, so I didn't have to worry about other people getting bored. And that's dangerous because, like Nancy, I want to read everything. And I was happy as a hog in slop because I didn't have to hurry. I didn't have to worry that other people were going, Mom, are we done yet? I could just mosey on through, stop for a coffee, mosey some more. Oh, that's just, I love museums. So if you could meet any historical person, who would it be and why? Nancy?
Toss up. Elizabeth I, because she was an incredible survivor and navigated the dangerous political shoals of her sister Mary's reign and her father's reign really well. But this is going to come as no surprise. I'd love to meet Richard III and have a chance to talk to him and kind of see what he was thinking at various times. Not that there would be any guarantee that a king would bother to answer my questions, but I'd like to have a go at it anyway.
Okay. Hildy? You're muted. Hildy, you're muted.
Probably Robert the Bruce. Why not? Let's go for him. Wouldn't it be cool to to sit in a room and see what he was talking about, or planning or plotting, or what was going on, by speaking to him and hearing him talk. And I would also have liked to meet for tea Mary Queen of Scots and chat with her for maybe an afternoon and get to know her. She must have been fascinating.
Yeah, for me, it would be Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was Richard II's mother, and she was a phenomenal lady. She lived to be in her 90s back in the 1100s, which tells me she had a sturdy constitution. And when Richard got imprisoned during one of the Crusades, Eleanor raised money, raised an army, marched off to the Levant to rescue Richard. Yeah, it's really bad when you're the king and your mom has to come after you with an army to get you out. But nevertheless, she rescued him and she brought him back. Well, then, ungrateful wretch that he was, he felt threatened by her power, and so he put her under house arrest. But Eleanor was clever, and she decided to invite all of the most famous bards and storytellers of the time to the castle where she was under house arrest, and made it the coolest place for the young sons and daughters of the nobility. And this is where the whole courtly love idea comes from. That was very big. It was sort of like having all the rock stars of the day at your palace. And so the children of the nobility loved Eleanor. And when they grew up and took over, they let her out because they liked Auntie Eleanor. And I just think she is this badass, wily woman who lived to a ripe old age. And I would love to have, a chance to sit down and just go, so tell me all about it. That would be a lot of fun. In all your researching, have you come across something that history says is absolutely not the way everybody thinks it was? Or have you found a contradiction that just set you back? Kind of like what I mentioned about cowboys were only really around for 15 years. Anything that just made you go, huh, Hildy?
I can't think of anything really off the top of my head. I'm trying to remember. There was something that I was researching because I wanted to have my heroine be more of the aggressor in a relationship. And I looked and looked and looked, and I knew for sure, and maybe I was looking the wrong way, but I know there was a holiday in Scotland where women would choose the man and take off with them and go do some fun stuff. And it had no consequences on her, on how she was looked upon and stuff like that. And then I couldn't find it anywhere. I'm like, did I imagine it? But I know that I've read about it. So I'm wondering if I read about it and it was not true, but I swear it happened. And I know that it was a holiday. And so I'm still on the search for that, but I can't think of the top of my head of something that I found out that historians have not really written about. There's tons of stuff. There's tons of stuff looking at the everyday stuff that historians are like, or that you look up and they're like, this doesn't happen. And then you go to the castles or something, you're like, well, yes, you don't know what happened between people. Of course, some things that, happen.
Okay. Nancy?
Not so much a contradiction as something that really surprised me. When I was doing the research for the King's Champion, I found out from my British friends and then really started looking into it that a lot of houses in Britain didn't have indoor bathrooms at the time of the Second World War. They still had night soil men who came around and emptied the equivalent of the outhouse pit at the time. I have a friend whose husband is slightly older than we are, and he grew up in a small town in Cambridgeshire in the run-up to the war, and he remembers going to the village pump to get water for his grandmother. So hot and cold running water, not universal at that point. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because a lot of these houses are a couple of 100 years old. Retrofitting plumbing and bathrooms would be a very expensive proposition. Mm-hmm. So I just always assumed that living conditions there were like living conditions here, and really they weren't. And the contrast was interesting. But in terms of contradicting things that have been written, that doesn't really qualify. It just was something that surprised me a lot.
I think for me, there's this running joke, particularly in the epic fantasy writing world, about stew, that all everybody must eat in the past was stew, because that's what shows up in the movies. Let's have stew. And they go to the pub. Here's a bowl of stew. And, there would be plenty of reasons why stew would be a popular dish, because it gets rid of the leftovers if there are any, and it is rather stretchable as a meal. So I'm sure they did eat their fair share of stew. But when you start looking at the what has survived of recipes from back in the day, and that can be from 100 years ago, or what we've found of recipes that date back to the Middle Ages, depending on your station in life and the local foods available, they had a great deal of variety, and they got really imaginative, especially at the upper classes, of what they ate. They had an odd fascination with quail eggs. I don't understand. But aside from that, you know, they had these and if you were royal, they had these multi-course dinners with all these different things. And when you realize that they cooked all of that over an open flame or in an oven that was adjacent to an open flame, and there were no thermometers, and there was no way to set the temperature, and there was, you know, all of this had to be guesstimated. And still, they turned out these elaborate culinary pies and cakes and roasts and stuff. I'm kind of in awe of that, because I sort of struggle even with all the modern appliances and dials and information to not burn something. And I'm looking at these people going, damn, you know, you did pretty fine. So that amazes me. It goes back to the everyday thing, is how the heck did you cook dinner and know it was done? So yeah. Now, as we're coming down to the end of our hour, but one more set of questions before we get into the wrap up, and that is, what book or movie, or a couple of them, from historical times just have stayed with you and maybe deepened your love of history, or really got you fascinated about something? Hildy?
There's this movie called Belle. It's believe Victorian London, and it is I don't know if you guys have seen it. It is about this lord who brings his daughter, who he's fathered with a woman from the West Indies. So she is of mixed ethnicity, and he brings her to his father, the Duke and Duchess, because he is about to go off to war. I loved that movie, and it really fascinated me to, I don't know, of course it was the dresses and the beauty of it, and how times in London at that time were changing. Civil rights was beginning there to emerge and stuff like that. And just the interaction of her with her, you know, who were, she was in a group of young women her age. I would say she's probably 16 or 17, about marriageable age for those times. And she was the highest one in society compared to her, the women there and the guys there. And it was just the way they did that movie. It is so good. And I believe it's based on a true story. And I wish I could remember the name of the person that it's based on. But if you have not had a chance to watch that movie, Belle, I think everybody should watch it. It's beautiful. It really is. And it brings a lot of what was going on in London at the times, and besides her story. It stuck with me since I watched it.
Yeah. Nancy?
When I was in grade school, there was this program called The Wonderful World of Disney on every Sunday night. And they did a program called When Knighthood Was in Flower, which was about the romance of Charles Brandon and Henry Tudor's sister, Mary, who should not be confused with his daughter, who became Queen Mary. I loved it. It's what kicked off my interest in English history. And then when I got older and actually read historical accounts of that period, I realized that that movie was what we might politely call highly fictionalized. But I still retain a certain fondness for it. And I really do think it kicked off my interest in English history. And then, of course, I've already discussed the Manly Wade Wellman books for colonial America. And there was an author named Inglis Fletcher who wrote a whole series of historical novels set in North Carolina, beginning with the era of the Lost Colony and going up to the ratification of the Constitution. And I love those books. And we actually went to Edenton one afternoon on our way back and forth to the beach. And a lot of the colonial structures are still there. The main characters in the later books all lived in Edenton, which is in eastern North Carolina. So really those three.
Okay. You know, one of the ones that has stuck with me for so long is the 1980s TV miniseries of Brideshead Revisited, which is based on an Evelyn Waugh novel, and it's set in that World War I era where everything in Britain was changing because of the war, and the aristocracy was losing its power, and the social mores were shifting. And it was, just so beautifully filmed, and also such a complex and human plot that I got sucked into it. And that one has just stayed with me. I know there have been remakes since then, but I thought that one was particularly well done, and certainly got me hooked on that era, and going to places like Biltmore to go through and go, oh yeah, I could live here. Give me the library. And I think book-wise, there was a book I read because I bought it at the Scholastic book sale, and it was called Farewell to Manzanar. And it was a true story written by someone who had been a teenage girl during the Japanese relocation camps in World War II, and her family had been forced to leave their comfortable suburban home and go to one of those camps. And it was her memoir of that time. And that hadn't been something I had ever been taught in a history class that anybody had ever mentioned before. And I think that's when it shifted how I looked at history, and where I started looking to make sure who was telling the story and what might they be skipping over because they didn't like those pieces. And it forever changed the way I consumed history. And so I thank that little Scholastic book. It's still on my shelf in its 1970s cover. Well, folks, we have blown through our time. So before we wrap things up, please tell everybody where we can find you online. And if you have any recent, current, or upcoming new releases, we want to know all about them. Hildy?
Well, I can be found mostly on Facebook at Hildy McQueen. I'm also on Instagram as Hildy McQueen. My best place to find all my books is on Amazon under my name. And I have the 5th book in the Clan Ross of the Hebrides called The Stag that just released on February 15th. And each of my books in this series is pretty much, you can pick any of them up and read them and not feel like you missed anything. I write them so that they can stand alone. So if you haven't tried anything, try that. The Lion, which is the book behind me, is the first book in that series. It's at a discounted price, and it is also on Amazon KU. So those people that are subscribed can read it, under their subscription. So yeah, this has been so much fun.
Awesome. Nancy?
You can find information about me and my books at nancynorthcott.com. I'm most active on Twitter. I'm on there kind of like Hildy says she's on Facebook. I'm there a lot, and I'm at Nancy Northcott. My most recent release was Renegade Mage, which is part of my Light Mage Wars historical contemporary paranormal fantasy series. The King's Champion, the concluding volume of the Boar King's Honor, will be out sometime early this summer. You can find me in person at RavenCon and Con Carolinas. And just real quick a plug, if you're interested in the controversy of Richard III and his nephews, read The Survival of the Princess in the Tower by Matthew Lewis, who takes an exhaustive look at all the theories about the fates of those two boys.
Awesome. I'm pretty easy to find online at gailzmartin.com and morganbryce.com. All the social media is a variation of those names, and I am really active on Facebook, somewhat active on Twitter. I've got boards out there on Pinterest. I am newly active, but trying to make up for lost time on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. So I'm pretty easy to find out there. The new book as Gail and Larry is Wasteland Marshals Volume 1, which is in our near future post-apocalyptic series. And that collects the first 4 novellas into one omnibus. And then also on the Morgan Bryce side, The Devil You Know, which is book number 6 in the Witchbane series. So lots coming up there. I'm also going to put in a plug for those watching this live and during Coastal Magic's run this year. Nancy and I both have links to our Rafflecopters in the chat, and we'll be putting those in the comments section. So it's a great way to enter for a chance to win some cool free books. So thank you both so much for being with us today. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Coastal Magic and more continual coming right up. So stay tuned. There's a lot of good stuff headed your way. Thanks for watching.